Good morning again. I think we're going to go ahead and get started again. Thank you for your patience and sorry for the delay. Neil Critch should be with us shortly, as I'd mentioned. Those of you who were already here a few minutes ago, Neil is stuck in the horrendous traffic right now on 16th Street, but should be with us soon. He'll come in when he gets here and we'll do some catch up. But I did want to get started. My name is Lucy Kurtzer-ellenbogen from the United States Institute of Peace. And on behalf of USIP and our colleagues here at Carnegie, with whom we're delighted to be co-hosting this event today, we'd like to welcome you. Thank you for coming so early in the morning, particularly. I know that 9 o'clock panels can be challenging. We're looking forward to an enlightening and lively discussion today with our panelists and with you on the subject of institution building, Palestinian institution building. As mentioned, this is a co-production, if you will. So in addition to our two fantastic outside experts, Howard Sumker from USAID and al-Omari, excuse me, from the American Task Force on Palestine, we're thrilled to have Nathan Brown from Carnegie. He's currently non-resident senior associate at the Middle East program here. And we will be joined by Neil Critch, who's senior scholar in residence at USIP. So before introducing our panelists and our topic further today, I did want to flag that today's panel is part of a series that we will be hosting at USIP. We're going to be putting on a series of panels throughout the year, through the end of this year and into 2011, on what we're calling internal challenges on the road to peace. And those basically are what we're considering to be domestic Israeli or domestic Palestinian concerns that have strong implications for the broader Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Arab conflict and for international efforts towards a peaceful resolution of that conflict. So we hope we'll get to see a lot more of all of you at these panels throughout the year. Back to our panel today, towards a Palestinian state, is institution building succeeding? As you're all aware, a subject that's been getting a lot of play, certainly over the last year or so, but currently also in the press. We're here today just a little bit past the midway point in the ambitious 2-year plan laid out by Prime Minister Salam Fayyad to build the necessary infrastructure for a viable Palestinian state. So it seems like a perfect time to take a look back and also forward and at some of the following questions. Are institutions approaching readiness for statehood at this point? What obstacles exist to progress on the ground? How does the state building track align with the negotiating track? And what are the challenges or opportunities presented by the coinciding 1-year goal for completion of direct peace talks along with this state building plan? So as I said, we're looking forward to a lively discussion this morning regarding what has been achieved and what is still needed for Palestinian state building to succeed, and whether it can be accomplished in the upcoming year. And we couldn't have a better set of panelists to address, analyze these topics, hopefully offer some answers today. There is a list, I hope some of you or all of you picked up, of bios, more detailed bios of our panelists outside. But I'd just like to take a brief time to introduce them. Howard Sumker, who is with us from USAID. He's been with USAID for 25 years and is currently the acting deputy assistant administrator for the Middle East. But he comes to us fresh from a stint since 2006 as the director of the USAID mission to the West Bank and Gaza. During that time, he led USAID's assistance program for economic, social, and democratic development for the Palestinians. Nathan Brown is, as I mentioned, non-resident senior associate of the Middle East program here at Carnegie and a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He's an expert on many subjects, but specifically Islamist movements, Palestinian politics, and Arab law and constitutionalism. His most recent book, Resuming Arab Palestine, presents research on Palestinian society and governance after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. And also specifically pertinent to today, among several other publications, he's also the author of 2 recent reports published by Carnegie, Are Palestinians Building a State, which came out in July, and the follow-up, Fayyad is not the problem, but Fayyadism is not the solution to Palestine's political crisis, which just came out earlier this month, I believe. al-Omari is the advocacy director at the American Task Force in Palestine, Prior to that, he served in various positions with the Palestinian Authority, including Director of the International Relations Department in the Office of the Palestinian President and advisor to former Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas. And Neil, as I said, who will be joining us, is the Senior Scholar in Residence in the Center for Mediation and Conflict Resolution at the United States Institute of Peace. He analyzes and advises on efforts to strengthen the Palestinian justice system, and since 1999 has directed a project on Palestinian-Israeli legal dialogue and cooperation. Again, we look forward to our discussion. If I can ask Howard to start us off. And again, thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you. I have a new app on my iPhone here, and I just touched it and I screwed it up. So you have to. This is going to more or less keep me on time if I can do it. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to particularly be on this panel with people that I've worked with, including Neil Kritz. Welcome, Neil. A lot over the years. All right, to know whether Palestinian state building is succeeding, I think we first need to know what it is we're trying to accomplish. And I want to talk a little bit briefly about that, about what a state will need, what it will need to be able to provide to its people, what kind of functions it needs to carry out, and a little bit about the context in which this is happening. But mostly what I want to focus on is what USAID is doing to go about state building in the Palestinian territories to help the Palestinians create those institutions. Let me start by looking at the context of Palestinian development and the challenges that, that the PA faces. The West Bank and Gaza, or Palestine, if you will indulge me that simplification, has a per capita income of about $2,900. This is a little more than half of Jordan's and just over 1/10 of Israel's. It puts Palestine in the lower middle income category of the World Bank Economic Development ranking. It sits amidst Vietnam, Djibouti, Nicaragua, and Uzbekistan, but it's a little bit better, measurably better than, for example, Kosovo and Yemen. So it's a country without significant resources. The Palestinian Authority is still new at governing. It was created as an interim governing institution in 1994 as part of the Oslo Accords, and 16 years later, it's still an interim governing institution. Despite its status, it has clearly created over the past few years a vision of what a Palestinian state would look like. And a year ago, it published that vision for the world in the program of the 13th government. Thirdly, the PA has taken on the challenge of state building even without having all of the authorities that a normal state would have. The Israeli occupation complicates their task, and at the same time, it presents challenges to the donors who are helping to build the state institutions. Finally, Palestinian state building is taking place in a highly charged political environment. It's an environment of internal Palestinian political conflict, which sometimes turns violent, and in the continuing conflict with Israel, which fortunately is now mostly a cold conflict. Move Palestine to some other location, give it a fixed border, give it contiguous territory, and I think its current governance structure would stack up well in the community of nations. A few years ago, a senior Israeli official remarked to me about the difficulty that the Palestinians were having participating in the Joint Economic Committee, which is one of the Oslo constructs. On the day after Israeli independence in 1948, he said, everyone came to work to do the same thing, the same jobs they had been doing for years. Nothing changed. And that's exactly how it needs to be for the Palestinians. They can't start to learn their jobs or build their institutions the day after independence. They will need to be already proficient. And despite the formidable obstacles, it's imperative that they stay on this track of state building. What does it mean for them to govern themselves? Well, a prerequisite for statehood is the ability to provide security for its citizens. Palestine must also be able to ensure that there are no threats to the security of Israel from within its state. This is the most fundamental requirement put on the Palestinians in the Oslo Accords. The United States, although not USAID, has been instrumental in training and professionalizing the PA security forces. There is almost universal praise, including from the Israelis, for the PA's accomplishments in this regard. And this provides the enabling context for everything else we do. So what else do we need to do? The PA needs a rule of law regime to protect individual rights, ensure due process, and enforce contracts. It needs to provide timely and just adjudication of criminal cases and civil disputes. It's essential that you have rule of law to go along with the security enhancements, and I think this is what Neil is going to talk about. I won't belabor that one. The state needs a legal and regulatory environment that encourages business investment. It must provide services to its citizens: water, sanitation, schools, hospitals. These are both to meet basic needs as well as to facilitate economic development. And finally, the state needs to ensure its long-term fiscal viability, which means it has to collect revenues, it has to assess fees, and it has to manage its expenses in a way that don't leave an unmanageable deficit. This right now is a problem for the Palestinians. So those are the constraints in the context. Let's talk about the mechanics of state building, and in particular, how USAID is working. We have been working on Palestinian state building more or less since Oslo. Since the formation of the current government in 2007, our efforts have intensified dramatically. We engage with the Palestinian Authority in virtually every sector, in every aspect of their institutional development. What I want to do is two things: talk about our education program as an example of the way we intensively work in a single sector, which I could also talk about in the context of the health sector and to a lesser extent in the rule of law, justice sector. And then secondly, talk about a different approach we take, which is a little more widespread and a little bit less intense on a ministry-by-ministry basis. So let me start with education. In 2007, the newly appointed Minister of Education led something called the Palestinian Education Initiative, which was a multi-donor Palestinian cooperative effort to create a 5-year strategy for the education sector. It talked about facilities, it talked about teacher qualifications and teacher programming, it talked about pedagogy and other aspects of the substantive parts of the education. An experienced professional with a clear vision, the minister garnered considerable donor support, including from USAID, and our program is shaped around the goals that are contained in the 5-year strategy. It has many components. First of all, most obviously, we continue to build schools. Last year, we constructed 7 schools. Not nearly enough to cover the deficit in schools they have, but with other donor efforts, in fact, the PA now proudly touts the fact that there are nowhere in the West Bank double schools or districts on double shifts, as was very common until a couple of years ago. We're working with the ministry and local schools to modernize teaching methods and to introduce critical thinking into the curriculum at elementary and secondary levels, and we're creating new modes of community school relationships. We're doing this through a program we call Model Schools Network, which began as a partnership with 17 private schools and now includes 40 public schools. Thirdly, we work with the public and private institutions that provide vocational education and training. We're linking them to private businesses who can help ensure that what they teach in those programs meets market demand, and they can also provide both internships and jobs for the graduates. Our assistance goes across the board. We support the ministry's ambitious agenda to introduce IT into the classroom. We're supporting Bard College's cooperative efforts with Al-Quds University to set up a Master of Arts in Teaching program at Al-Quds. And we have a plan, which I hope they will implement this coming year, to support the ministry's extensive teacher training program. We try to do this following good development practice. The ministry's priorities provide our basic guidance. We work our program details out with them. We concentrate on the essential strategic areas and focus on achieving visible changes. The trick is to balance the program, not to invest too much in an area that would tax the absorptive capacity of the ministry and the local schools, and not to spread so thinly that we don't have an impact. The challenges for us are to find that balance, to invest strategically, and to push the ministry to maintain its reform and modernization efforts. The challenges for the ministry are to maintain its focus on the reform program, to access sufficient Palestinian Authority resources to take the reforms to scale, and to deepen their capacity and institutionalize the reforms so they can survive political changes, which we know sooner or later will come. Now let me talk about another program that we do, which takes a somewhat different approach with 5 ministries under an across-the-board capacity enhancement effort. Here we spread our resources more thinly. We have crafted a strategy that's designed to show immediate impact, to spread the benefits across sectors and across geographic regions, and at the same time to build sustainable capacity within each ministry. We selected partners for this project carefully, made sure that the minister was committed, that the ministry had the capacity to participate with us, that they were in fact interested in capacity building and not just on the high visibility goodies that we had available under the program. Our tactic has a kind of simple elegance. In the first year, identify a unit in the ministry with which to partner, work with them to develop a project that will have short-term impact, high visibility, and provide a service. And then once we've got them engaged in the program, keep them with us for the next 2 years, doing the kind of capacity building that's necessary to expand and sustain that impact. The kinds of tangible projects that were most popular generally involved extending citizen services to field offices or improving citizen services within existing offices. The Ministry of Finance has a brand new property tax collection office in Hebron. The Ministry of Interior issues passports and civil registry papers in modernized centers in Hebron and Jenin. The Ministry of Transportation provides driver's licenses and registers vehicles in rehabilitated facilities in Ramallah, Nablus, and Hebron. The concepts here that we introduced include one-stop shop, a single queuing system, computerized records and processing, and my personal favorite, no smoking in the building. These centers look like anything you would find in any city in America. In fact, they're better because they're brand new. And the importance of these is they immediately convey to the people who need the service that the government is doing something for them and doing something which affects their lives in a very direct way. A process that used to take a week or a month, they now go into an office, they take a number, and in 20 minutes they've got their driver's license. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but they certainly can have basic paperwork done in that quickly. A year into the project, we then kicked off the capacity building effort with a big conference, at least a couple of hundred people, staff at the 5 ministries we were working with. The Prime Minister and I opened up the conference to kind of help sort of boost enthusiasm. And what they learned in that 2-day workshop was what a center of excellence is, how you build it, how you use it to create a model of service orientation and ministry management that will help them provide their services efficiently and effectively. That work is still going on. It's proceeding apace. There's a lot of other things we could talk about. Building competitive private sector, strengthening civil society, constructing modern infrastructure, all of these things USAID is working on, and all are essential to the process. But I won't do that because I'm essentially already out of time. To anticipate a bit, because my app is working, to anticipate a bit, I think that Nate Brown is about to tell you that all of that is not state building, just public administration reform. That the PA is not creating institutions, but only improving on the ones Arafat built, that Hamas is better at it in Gaza than is the PA in West Bank, and I'm guessing that because I've read his 2 papers. He may tell you that without a vibrant political process, the PA has no legitimacy, that it is better to focus on political process than on substantive governance. I don't agree. Improving the technical capacity of PA institutions, meeting citizens' needs, and instilling transparency, accountability, and sustainability are essential. The politics of conflict aside, the PA is probably as ready to run its own country as are maybe a third or half of the 190-some member states of the United Nations. Whatever comes of the current round of negotiations, and as long as the center holds, the Palestinians will continue to experience palpable improvements in their lives and will become increasingly able to manage their own affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to hold questions to the end, although I have to say I'm curious to ask about the success of the no smoking in the building rule, how it worked out. Neil?
Thank you, and sorry for the late arrival. The fire on 16th Street took over. The question is, how do you measure the success or progress of institution building? That can be done in a variety of ways. I'd say that anyone who has simply tried to drive in Ramallah a handful of years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, today, will tell you that there's something different happening on the ground. Because while you wouldn't be able to get anywhere, as many of you know, without being snarled in completely unregulated traffic that was a mess and very difficult to get through and very frustrating, instead, with the population of the city having doubled over the past decade, in addition to the enormous increase in commuter traffic, when you drive in Ramallah today, there are police on the street regulating traffic, unarmed, issuing tickets if you do the wrong thing, and traffic moves like it's supposed to. That's a piece of, that's an indication that something's happening. Palestinian institution building, I'd suggest, needs to be put in context in 2 different ways. One, relative to where it's coming from, and also relative to other countries, both those in transition and those considered stable. Too often in discussing targets and goals for fragile or broken states, many in the international community set the bar too high, setting standards that are completely unrealistic and that are not achieved by far more advanced and affluent and stable nations. So points of comparison will be useful. And as Howard suggested, I will focus mainly on the justice sector in this regard. Where it's coming from. The World Bank launched a multi-million-dollar effort to try to strengthen the Palestinian justice system that ran from 1997 to 2003. The bank ultimately closed down the project in 2003, and its final report said that it was due to it was a complete failure due to a lack of political will within the PA to really be serious about the rule of law or strengthening the justice system. That was 2003. The contrast with the current government's 2-year plan to build institutional capacity and the things that have actually been accomplished during the course of that plan on the ground are significant. I guess it'll be a subject of discussion ongoing, but Nathan in his recent paper suggested that more institutions were created early on under Oslo that have been created under the recent government, and that's an indication that institution building really is not proceeding. But announcing the creation of a government institution is a generally easy and high-profile part, but the real work of institution building, the less glamorous step-by-unsteady step process of building institutions begins after that. For years, many of the ministries and agencies of the PA were largely empty shells, and they were staffed by people who came to their jobs through political patronage or family connections. And for some PA institutions, I think it's fair to say that some of that still describes the situation. The process of professionalization and capacity building doesn't happen overnight, but it is happening. So in the judiciary, as one example, a couple of years ago, a process was put in place, a new application system for any judge or prosecutor who has to go through a written examination, an oral examination, proctored by stakeholders from throughout the justice system, that has replaced a system of patronage. Is there a little bit of leakage? Do few people get in based on patronage? Sure, they do in this country too. It happens everywhere. Once they're in, a judicial training institute exists now, and there's a mandatory 2-year training program for new candidate judges and prosecutors that they're going to have to go through to actually learn to do what they're doing properly. As an example of deepening the institution building in the judiciary, it's moved beyond simply appointing judges to the real work of focusing on the guts of the system, administrative personnel, creation of an administrative department for the courts, a strategic planning unit that can actually look to the future of the judiciary and see what's needed, a unit that focuses on inspection of judicial performance and lays out what judges need to do to improve that performance. A few statistics will be useful. By a few years ago, the Palestinian courts had logged up a backlog of some 65,000 cases in the system. Just 2 years ago, the head of an EU assistance unit charged with assistance to the justice system suggested that it would take Palestinian courts 14 years to clear that backlog. And 2 courts, he suggested, were so backlogged that it would take 50 years in order to clear the docket. The system wasn't working. Members of the public didn't bother filing their criminal complaints with the police or the prosecution because the experience suggested it wouldn't achieve anything. Parties to a civil dispute didn't bother going to the courts because they viewed them as largely dysfunctional. Recent years saw an increase in people turning to sulha, other forms of traditional dispute resolution, or simply taking the law into their own hands. But as a result of a lot of the reforms and hard work that's been done in the security and justice sectors, the courts are functioning today in a way that has never been seen since the establishment of the PA. 2007 to 2008 saw a 2/3 increase in the number of cases resolved in the courts. From 2008 to 2009, the number of newly registered cases increased by 47%, a figure that could overwhelm many a weak system. But instead, in the same period, the number of cases resolved increased by another 67%, from 76,000 to 127,000. Over a 3-year period, the processing of criminal felony cases has increased by 236% in the Palestinian courts. The clearance rate for civil cases in the first instance courts for 2009, the ratio of how many cases are disposed versus how many new cases are lodged, was 98%. I said it's useful to compare it to other countries. That's better than Italy and Spain. The Council of Europe recently published statistics on the efficiency of the judiciaries in 32 European countries. So here's another point of comparison. The 2009 clearance rate for the Ramallah first instance courts, which, as one might expect, have the largest number of cases of any Palestinian district, exceeds the rates achieved by their counterparts in nearly every one of those 32 European countries. Or a different point of comparison, the European Court of Human Rights in 1999 had a backlog of 60,000 cases, almost as many as the Palestinian courts had. By early 2010, the European court's backlog had doubled to 120,000, with one report estimating that at current rates, it would take 46 years to clear the backlog. Palestinian judiciary, instead, during that same period of time, has begun to significantly reduce its backlog while dramatically increasing the number of cases processed. USAID did a survey in 2008 to try to determine, what does the Palestinian public think? Is this real? And what they found was that 3/4 of West Bank Palestinians now have confidence in the judiciary and perceive it as being fair and impartial. That's a dramatic shift from what it was not long before that. But a far more revealing indicator is the actual shift in practice of Palestinian society. The dramatic increase in new cases being filed before the courts is not limited to criminal cases that result from better performance by the police and prosecution. There's also been a notable increase in the number of civil disputes that people are now bringing to the courts, shifting back from customary justice or other forms of dispute resolution because they now think that they can actually get this done in the courts. The case of Jenin is useful as an example. Jenin was a system that didn't work. Jenin was a system that was viewed by Israel as a source of terrorism, viewed by Palestinians as a place where you couldn't safely open your shop. Criminals ran the street. The national security forces that have been trained, deployed first to Jenin, the level of arrests went up significantly. Arms were confiscated. Court orders were enforced for the first time. I can tell you that I went into the prosecutor's office in Jenin early on at the time of the initial deployment, and nothing worked. It was a broken system. In 18 months, from October 2008 to March 2010, the number of criminal cases pending in the courts in Jenin, though, was reduced by 80% as a result of a series of reforms, from 6,500 to 1,300. When I was there recently, the transformation was remarkable. One saw a system that actually is working with people who have been trained and with people who have completely reshaped how they do their work. Building a strong, independent judiciary, of course, is about far more than numbers of disposed cases. Let's be clear about that. It's not just about how many cases can you run through the system. So here's another indicator. There has been a phenomenon, as you may know, in Palestinian society, particularly over the course of the last 2 years, of the police performing far better than before, the national security forces performing well, but the other security forces arresting large numbers of civilians. They used to send them to civilian courts because they had them under their control. But now the civilian courts say, well, what's the crime? If he's a member of Hamas, that's not a crime, so we'll release him. So they stopped doing it. So the security forces thought, well, we have these terrorists. We can't send them to civilian courts. They have all those nice rules. We'll have to send them, we'll put them in detention centers off the grid, and then we'll send them to a special military tribunal. If this sounds familiar, it wouldn't be surprising. And in most countries, that's where it would end, in many countries, with an average or weak judiciary. In the Palestinian case, the Palestinian Civilian High Court issued a series of decisions taking on that process and stating that the military court did not have jurisdiction over these civilians, therefore the proceeding was unlawful and the person must be released. The decisions were ignored for a while until the Prime Minister issued a directive stating that all entities of the PA must comply with all decisions of the High Court. And overwhelmingly, not 100%, but overwhelmingly, that order has been respected. The decisions of the High Court have been respected. The problem still exists, but it's an independent judiciary that is actually standing on its legs and asserting itself. It's also important to note that real institution building isn't just about creating institutions. And in fact, one of the most significant steps taken by the PA has been the dismantling of certain institutions. Just consider for a moment the frustration regularly voiced by politicians in the US and other Western countries over how hard it is to eliminate a single ineffective or problematic government program or agency. When Yasser Arafat died, he left 17 security forces in place. So individual centers of power that could be played against one another to ensure that one person was in control. Closing down those forces, those are the guys with the guns, those aren't the nice Democrats who were trying to stage elections. Taking power away, closing down agencies like that, consolidating them in a record period of time, in just a course of a few years, is probably one of the hardest things to do in any country in transition. But again, the progress has been significant. Is it 100%? No. But is closing down many of those security agencies, consolidating them, rationalizing what's needed, a step of progress? Absolutely. Just a couple of more quick stats. There's a change that one can see in different agencies, and it doesn't exist throughout the government, but the creation of a service mentality. Whether you walk into a notary public's office, whether you try to deal with the police, whether you deal with others, that people are being taught their job is actually to serve the people. And there are changes. The creation of a $500 million mortgage finance facility this year that'll make it possible for home ownership to become more accessible is an enormous step in institution building beyond the justice issues. The stats that many have seen in terms of the 7% growth in GDP, a growth rate that was matched in 2009 or exceeded by only 7 countries in the world, was impressive. Granted, it was starting from a low level, but it's impressive. The World Bank suggests that that can be matched again this year. Some will say, well, the economy is only supported by dependence on foreign aid. Take away the $3 billion Israel gets from the US, and that would be a hit to its economy too. Take away the aid that's given to many countries, and one could raise questions about their economies. Battle still exists between agencies. Institutions don't all function effectively. The enterprise is still fragile. And in many instances, it's not yet sufficiently deep-rooted or institutionalized to be certain that it can survive certain changes in personalities, should they occur. But after years of observing nothing other than stagnation and cynicism in this field, it's encouraging to see that, yes, as Howard said, I think at least in terms of certain sectors, Palestinian Authority is building a system that is capable of functioning as a state on a par with other countries.
Finally going to give Nathan Brown a chance to speak for himself and see how our prognosticators did up here in terms of predicting what he'd say.
Thank you very much. If I were to sum up the previous two presentations, there would be 3 points. Number one, also the current cabinet in Ramallah is doing all sorts of good things. Number two, it deserves our support. And number three, Nathan's got a different take on things. I agree with all three. Okay? Current government is doing all sorts of good things. It is. It deserves our support, yes. And yet, I don't quite see these things the same way. I'm still going to be the skunk who's going to tell you things that are politically unpalatable, but I don't think I think are close to undeniable. Let me do this by posing 4 questions and answering each of them, and doing it within the allotted time. First, are Palestinian institutions being built? My basic answer is no. They are being kept alive, and that's significant and good. Second, is a pattern of institutional change we're observing part of state building? No, it just isn't. It's administration without politics. Third, the third question is, Nathan, why do you think you're so smart? Don't they know this in Ramallah? And my answer is yes, but they're afraid to say so for good reason. And fourth, can Palestinian institution building, true Palestinian institution building, be part of peacemaking? And my answer is yes, if you're living in the 1990s, and we're not. We missed our chance, and that is a tragedy. But at this point, in a sense, I think they can't both be done at the same time. So first, are Palestinian institutions being built? You've heard people who have tremendous and extended expertise talk about specific segments. My perspective is a little bit different. Okay, my perspective is of somebody who studied this intensively in the late 90s and early part of early 2000s, and then goes back periodically. So it's I compare it to time-lapse photography. I take a look at what's happened this year, what happened when I was there 6 months ago, what happened 6 months before that. So it gives me some historical depth. And what that leads me to say is that no, there isn't institution building going on. Something else is going on that isn't necessarily bad. There are lots of good things, but I don't think it's institution building. If you take a look at the institutional history of anything Palestinian, you find it's archaeology. You'll find Ottoman levels, Mandate era levels, Jordanian, Egyptian, Israeli levels. Most of the structures that the Palestinian Authority is operating with are no different. The most impressive burst of institution building was done not in the last couple of years, but in the 1990s. It had all kinds of problems, but let me take a look at 2 of the sectors that people have talked about, education and law. Education. When the Palestinian Authority was originally created in 1994, what happened was you had basically a network of schools in the West Bank and Gaza with a rudimentary administrative apparatus attached to the Israeli civil administration. In the 1990s, the Palestinians first built a Ministry of Education, that is an administrative apparatus to oversee all this. They started writing their own Tawjihi or Sanawi Amma, basically the matriculation exam. They wrote their own curriculum. The various bodies of teachers, unions, and so on were slowly knitted together. This was an uneven process, and there were active and vibrant debates in Palestinian press and Palestinian society and the Palestinian Legislative Council about the course of this process. It was messy, it was incomplete, and there were certainly aspects that were unhealthy and even corrupt. But there was real institution building. What is going on in the last couple of years? Essentially, maintaining that system, improving it in some ways, taking schools off double shifts is a significant improvement if you're talking about the existing physical plant, about the toll it takes on teachers and students and so on. So but it's not doing anything fundamentally different in terms of institutions. It's taking existing institutions and making them operate a little bit more effectively. Something that, yes, is good and deserves our support, but is certainly not what I would consider to be a comprehensive state-building project. And there's reasons they can't do more, which I'll get to in a second. Rule of law. In the 1990s, you had a comprehensive you basically had the court system taken over by Palestinians, detached from the civil administration, and to some extent even from the Israeli legal system, and sort of stood on its own. You had some basic decisions made about the structures of courts, new sort of appeals level being added. You had comprehensive legislation being drawn up and implemented in all kinds of areas. Again, this was a messy project, and the sort of phenomenon that Neil talked about sort of a legal system that exists in one realm and an set of extra legal practices was very much alive in the 1990s. But, basically you want to send somebody to jail for a regular crime, you've got a regular court system. You want to send them to jail for a political crime, you have a special court system. And that certainly was operating in the 1990s, so there's certainly problems with that. What is happening now? Again, what have we heard? Again, some physical administrative improvements. So the regular courts, I would say, are basically getting back to the level that they were in the late 1990s. Basic political decisions about the structure of the courts are being deferred. The same sorts of institutional rivalries that were not answered in the 1990s. What's the relative balance between, or the relative role of the Ministry of Justice versus the Judicial Council, public prosecution? How is that going to be structured and handled and worked into is this a judicial function? Is it an administrative function, a governmental function? These are the same sorts of debates that they've been having since the 1990s and are still unanswered. And you have a government that is essentially ruling by decree and knows it. So how are you going to build comprehensive rule of law if you can't really write laws? You can't. And to pretend that you can, and to pretend that is part of a healthy state building process, I think misses what is essential for that to happen. So that's what the answer to the first question: are Palestinian institutions being built? No, but they're kept alive. Have seen some impressive administrative improvements in some areas, but basically getting back to, in my mind, to the level of the late 1990s. Second question: is this state building? I've foreshadowed the answer to that. My answer is no. The politics is missing. Anything involving democratic mechanisms are just plain gone. Sometimes that is unavoidable. Okay, sometimes the political split between the West Bank and Gaza is so severe that you cannot even have any kind of democratic procedures. But this government could not even organize local elections on the West Bank, had to cancel them at the last minute. And when you move outside the realm of administration, you find real serious political diseases. Political party system is basically disintegrated. It doesn't really exist in any healthy form anymore. Civil society, professional associations, Palestinian politics, if you compare it to the 1990s, is in a state of serious decay. So administration is continuing, divorced from the society. And if you read the reports of international observers, both international financial institutions, government bodies, and so on, between the lines, this is exactly what they're telling you. They will have a polite statement about how this is all adding up. The most recent World Bank report certainly did this, but then you read between the lines, and what you find is, as I say, political decay, an administrative process that is making some kind of limited progress, but is ultimately dependent on a political process that doesn't exist, if it's going to be sustained over the long term, and you have different areas where, the pattern shifts from area to area. The areas that the international community cares most about, which is security and fiscal affairs, you see actually probably more progress. And you move away from those areas and you don't begin to see the same kinds of patterns. And you see economic recovery that is heavily dependent on donor funds and on essentially a quiet security situation. So you have, in essence, a respite in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute in terms of violence, and a massive influx of donor funds, which is making possible an economic recovery, again, getting us back to the level of the late 1990s. But on a political basis that I don't see as sustainable state building. Okay, don't they know this in Ramallah? Why is it that this analysis shocks people and ticks a lot of people off? The answer is yes, they know this. They know that there are some improvements, that the political foundation underlying them is shaky and ultimately authoritarian. Even at the level of the leadership, there are certain things they know they cannot do. They're ruling by decree, and they know that. And as a result, you have a government or cabinet that issues legislation that because they realize its limited legitimacy, is kept to technical realms. If you're looking at comprehensive legislation of the kind that the Palestinian Authority really needs, they cannot issue it in this context because they have no legitimate process for issuing it. So they can issue technical improvements in existing legislation. They can draft whatever they want. But this is drafted within ministries, forwarded to the cabinet, forwarded to the president, without any mechanisms for public input or for anchoring this legislation or this legal framework in Palestinian society, and therefore it limits what they can do. The educational system, it's the same thing. Yes, they can make all kinds of improvements in the existing sort of tinker with the existing curriculum. But the education system and the curriculum is really the last tie between the West Bank and Gaza. Comprehensive educational reform in the West Bank that did not include Gaza would be politically unthinkable. They can't do much because if they brought through if they pushed through fundamental changes, they would be pushing West Bank and Gaza in different directions, something that, as I say, the government does not have the legitimacy to do, and they know they can't do it. So you've got, for instance, a curriculum review program that is very quietly tinkering with the existing curriculum by coordinating between the West Bank and Gaza. They can't move very far because then the Gazans go off, and the Gazan Ministry of Education will go off, and it will be going in a different direction. So the problem is that the leadership in Ramallah, although they're aware of this, and certainly when you get below the level of the leadership, you certainly hear, I think, just absolute political cynicism and disengagement from politics. But even at the leadership level, where they're heavily invested in this, they're realizing their limitations, but you've got essentially a political process that is so dependent on essentially international diplomatic and financial support that there's a very powerful political reason for presenting a happy face. That there's hope, there's a self-sustaining process, we can do this ourselves, we can march towards freedom, just supply the funds in the interim. This is just an interim mechanism, protect our political flank, and this will be state building. Let me put this in terms of a debate that Ghaith and I once had. He's been in politics for a long time, done all kinds of media work. He's used to talking to media. I'm not. There was one time we were both on Washington Post arguing with each other. This was in June 2007, right after the split between the West Bank and Gaza. And I'm there sort of sputtering, saying, but this is a violation of the Palestinian Basic Law, sounding, in a sense, almost idiotic. I mean, what are we doing talking about constitutional procedures when there's civil war going on? And Ghaith was quoted as saying, I think you'll remember this, is, with all due respect, who cares? Ghaith was right. Okay, I sounded stupid, he sounded right. And yet, if I asked the question, who cares? What I would say is, Palestinians care that they've got a political system that is basically dysfunctional. So yes, as an emergency measure, you can put together this cabinet. And yes, there is no choice but to march along this road. But to pretend that this is a road towards freedom or towards statehood, and even as it's completely disengaged from the Palestinian society and the Palestinian political system and overseeing a process of political decay, I think we're fooling ourselves. So let me turn very briefly to the final question. Can Palestinian institution building be part of peacemaking? I think there was a time when you could do this. You could basically, there were times, say, in the 1990s. The problem was the international community basically ignored the process of Palestinian state building in any serious political way. You could have done this in the early 2000s. Basically, had a process of internal institution building and a political process of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And basically, in the first case, the Palestinians were told, "We'll make peace now and worry about building right institutions later," by the international community. In the second, it was like, "Go reform your institutions, then come talk to us about peace." Neither worked. Those were times when you needed them together. Right now, I don't think you can. And let me illustrate this by asking a simple question. If there were a peace agreement tomorrow between Abu Mazen, whatever body he represents, and Netanyahu, how would Palestinians ratify and implement the agreement? There is no way. None. And if there isn't, why are we pretending that there is a viable diplomatic process? You've got no parliament, you've got a PLO that's dead, you've got a president whose term has expired. He has no authority to negotiate this agreement, and certainly to implement it, even if he had the authority to negotiate it. What you've got to do is fix the Palestinian political system first. And you cannot pursue peace building until that basic task is addressed. How do you fix a Palestinian political system? I think I'm out of time.
Lucky for you.
Thank you.
He's now going to put all of this in context for us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a problem when you're the last speaker. You come with a very neat, flowing presentation, then suddenly you have to respond to everything that was said before. So excuse me if I'm going to be a little bit disjointed with this. And I'll do what Nathan did and start with summing up what I heard so far. Significant progress has been made, progress that is seen by many here and internationally as putting the Palestinians in a place where they are ready for statehood in practical terms. I heard that this is not perfect. There are still problems and limitations and obstacles. And I heard that state building and institution building is not the solution to everything. I actually agree with all of the above. But I would fall on the side of preferring or believing that what we're seeing is very significant, it's transformative, it's changing the nature of both domestic Palestinian politics and the nature of the peace process and the whole diplomatic process. And my approach to these things, I must say, I would still stand with what I said the post a few years ago in terms of how you look at these things. At some level, who cares about the legalistic, mechanical arguments that we're hearing? It's political. The whole issue is political. The whole issue is about power and about creating and transforming a political culture. And what I believe is what we're seeing there is happening in institution building is very much doing the above. And let me explain. Of course, my job here is to talk about the context, political context, and I would identify two spheres that this is significant. One is domestic politics, one is foreign policy or the peace process, and I will conclude with some ideas of what do we do to strengthen and protect this process as we go along. In domestic terms, what I see, and here I disagree with Nathan profoundly, I see a very different process that we're seeing now from what we saw back in the 90s. Yes, in the 90s, the institutions were created, the ministries were formed, and the structures were put into place. The major difference from what we saw then and what we see now is then government was no more than a political tool of patronage for the late President Arafat. It was a way of doing two things: giving political goodies to your supporters. You're my support, I want to buy you off. Here, you become a director general and you can get 40 jobs for your friends and relatives. And it was, if you wish, a glorified social security system, which was creating government as a way of masking unemployment and masking the lack of economic development. It was very Egyptian in that regard. Today, we are seeing something different. We're seeing actually an attempt to restructure the ethos of civil service into one of actually service. You're not getting a job because you're my political crony. You're getting a job because actually your job is to help and serve the people. We're seeing it in more sector than some sectors more than other. We're seeing this as a halting process. We're seeing a lot of pushback. We're seeing today actually a big fight with many of the civil service unions about things like removing government cars from their use, some of the goodies that they started to take for granted. Of course, there is pushback, but we're seeing a fundamental change in the nature of what civil service and bureaucracy and government is seen by the officials themselves and by the public. A point that was raised, and this is where I'm going to start with my set presentation, is the issue of legitimacy. We always talk about the issue of legitimacy. And we often mistake electoral legitimacy with other forms of legitimacy. In terms of electoral legitimacy, no one in Palestine has it. Not the PLC, not the parliament, not the president, not the prime minister, not even the local councils. All of the terms have expired. But that is the nature of things there. One thing that's very interesting, now there are renewed reconciliation talks between Hamas and Fatah, and the one thing they agreed on is an election mechanism, which to my mind says they both believe it's not going to happen anytime soon, so they're agreeing onto something empty. There are not going to be any elections until we have a political resolution of the internal power dynamics, and this resolution is not going to be legal, it is political. And I don't see it happening anytime soon, and as such, we can bemoan and lament the fact there are no elections, but this is going to be a fact of life for a while to come, in my view. Unfortunate, but this is where we are. Of course, we need elections to happen, but since there are no elections happening anytime soon, let's start looking at other forms and other sources of legitimacy. Traditionally, legitimacy in the Palestinian system has been conveyed, and that was during the 90s, we saw it, in terms of history, and in terms of participation in the struggle, and in terms of how many years you spent in jail. This is traditionally the way it has been. Now we're seeing another and a new source of legitimacy being developed. Legitimacy in terms of performing your job and giving services. If you look at opinion polling among the Palestinians, you will see an increasingly rising popularity of the state building project, and you see extremely high approval ratings in terms of job delivery and in terms of in terms of when you talk about indicators, personal security, access to courts, things of this nature. There is a sense of political buy-in, a sense of popularity, and a sense that this is what government should be about. We see it reflected anecdotally and in the polls. As a result, any successful process, any success story in that region and elsewhere naturally develops enemies and develops opponents. And in Palestine, we have an interesting set of opponents for this project. One, and the obvious one, is Hamas. Hamas, for reasons of the security control that's being imposed in the West Bank and the creation of a new security sector that is effective, as opposed to fiefdoms that were warring between one another, is worrying Hamas. Equally, development and removal of or reduction of corruption and all of these issues, more effective and responsive government, is also disturbing Hamas. It's removing one of the gifts that kept giving, that the PA gave to Hamas, which is the corruption, which Hamas used usually and regularly and successfully for political purposes. This is being removed from their hands, and Hamas is very disturbed about that, but that's understandable. And I would say that's also negligible were it not for the fact that there is a split between the West Bank and Gaza. And unfortunately, while the PA continues to support Gaza in terms of paying salaries and paying for electricity and what have you, many of the institutional reform aspects of the process cannot happen in Gaza. And the Prime Minister was here last week, and one of the issues that he kept on harping on is how do we start reintroducing the PA into Gaza in a gradual manner, understanding the logistical difficulties. But the other source of opposition, which is more intriguing, is Fatah. Fatah is the ruling party traditionally in the West Bank. And Prime Minister Fayyad, who's overseeing the program, is not Fatah. He is an independent, political independent. Now, Fatah obviously is also fighting opposing the process for two obvious reasons. One is removing patronage from Fatah's hands, the corruption that came with the holding high jobs. Fatah will have to start competing actually outside government. It's disturbing. It changes the way Fatah has used to running business, but it's also, with the creation of a non-partisan security sector, it's removing Fatah's access to arms. to weapons. Traditionally, in the 90s, Fatah used to look at the security services as part of its militia. It cannot do this anymore with a new rationalized system. Things are not perfect, things have not gone to their exclusion, but now we have a security sector that's removing weapons from the hands of Fatah, and that's creating pushback from within that party. The process, though, did continue, and the reform process is continuing, partly because of the international support, but more importantly, I think, because of the protection and the space given to it by President Abbas, who himself is a Fatah person, but realizes that this process is particularly essential for domestic and foreign policy developments. One point that I would, though, mention is, given the confluence of interest between Hamas and Fatah in terms of opposition to this reform project, to the state-building project, I think that this is probably the only point that in the unity talks where Hamas and Fatah agree on fundamentally. And my concern with any national unity arrangement that we get in Palestine is the two main victims of such an arrangement would be first the peace process, which will collapse. Secondly, this project, which will also immediately go to an end with Fatah and Hamas blessing. One point that I'm going to mention here is the issue of, even though I talked about some of the practical, concrete aspects of what's happening, there is one intangible, transformative thing that this project is delivering to the Palestinians, and that's a change of the political culture. Political culture in Palestine has always been a culture of victimhood. The Israelis did this to us, the Americans did this to us, the Arabs have not done this to us. Now suddenly you have a sense of self-reliance. And it's unquantifiable, but you see it when you go there. The second sphere of politics that I'm going to talk about is foreign policy or the peace process. And I would start with 2 points. One point is that this state-building and institution-building process has essentially been kept away and separate from the political process, from the peace process. There is, in a sense, a firewall between the two because you want to separate the processes in practical terms, even though politically they are mutually reinforcing, as I would say. And secondly, of course, this is no replacement to the negotiations. Ultimately, these are two complementary tracks that hopefully will come to a point of convergence as progress continues. That said, one of the interesting developments that we've seen over the last year is this shift in thinking in this country and globally in terms of looking at this project. This project was always, when it started, was seen as a development project. You know, to be placed, and no offense, Howard, to be placed in AID and the development agencies of the various countries that are supporting it. Now it's becoming seen as a political project. Oh, okay. That means that I'm almost out of time. It's no coincidence that President Obama and Secretary Clinton are mentioning this in the same vein as they mentioned the peace process. There's a sense that there is a political need and utility for this. And I would, telegraphically, what I would say, the way it interacts with the peace process is manifold. One is it creates circumstances conducive to negotiations, particularly in security. Have we not had the security developments that we've had over the last couple of years, we will not be having negotiations today. That's simple. And what's interesting byproduct of this is, of course, is creating new constituencies within Israel that are supportive of the peace process. And it's interesting to see now probably the most pro-peace constituency in Israel is the IDF, the Israeli military, who have seen a new way of behavior among the Palestinians. This process, the state-building process, buffers the peace process, meaning the peace process will go through ups and downs. We're seeing one of the downs today and this week. We need to show a constant stream of progress as the peace process goes up and down. And I think this will help provide it. And one of the mistakes that we did when I was a negotiator is we go to our 5-star hotels, we do our negotiations, we look at the world from 30,000 feet. At the same time, there is no real buy-in in practical terms by the public. So this is creating, hopefully, that sense of buy-in. Creates pressure on the negotiation track. In a sense, if you build it, they will come. When you start seeing the World Bank and we start seeing the various international institutions saying the Palestinians are ready for statehood, it creates more political pressure, I think, on reaching a deal and makes reaching a deal more of a reality and a possibility. And finally, it creates a safety net in case of a stalemate or collapse. There is a likelihood, there is a possibility that this peace process might collapse come the spring, come next summer. We might realize it's not going to get us to a deal. Do we go back to a Camp David kind of scenario? Negotiations fail. Everything is over? Or do we start investing right now in a process that can help us sustain a degree of hope as we start to reassemble negotiations? 2 quick minutes here, 2 quick comments. How do we protect this project? it's still, I mean, it's taking root, but it's still very fragile. And I would say domestically, the way to protect it is to allow it to deliver. Not only deliver, but deliver better economy and better institutions, but also to deliver politically. Meaning, it has to be seen by the Palestinian public as moving us closer to statehood. I'm not talking about unilateralism here, I'm talking about agreed measures that will help us show a degree of progress. One point that the Prime Minister has been talking about, for example, allowing Palestinian security forces, the police, law and order security forces, to deploy in the various Palestinian populated areas beyond Areas A, where it is allowed to function today. The second one is, of course, keeping it afloat financially. And one very puzzling, troubling point is to see that Arab funders in particular this year have not been paying. It's not clear why, no one is giving an answer, but the Gulf, Saudi, whatever, are not paying, one exception being the Emirates. But this needs to change, and I think it's interesting to see that Obama and Clinton as well as talking about this. Finally, we need to insulate it from the ups and downs of negotiations. Traditionally, when I was a negotiator, when things are going back to the negotiating track, the Israelis would squeeze us by hitting us on the kind of what happens on the ground. Increase checkpoints, things of this sort. We need to insulate it. If there is pressure to be applied at the negotiation level, let's do it at the diplomatic level. But let's not make this process suffer due to the ups and downs, the inevitable ups and downs of negotiations. And I would, and by the way, one last point here. On this one, on how do you protect it, how do you buffer it from the ups and downs, look at what happens in the security sector. And look how creating a sense of American ownership of this process have helped shield it against many of the crises that it went through. It's something to look at, and maybe here in the States, we can start developing. On this, and 4 minutes late, I would say thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much to all of you. We are going to take questions now. There are microphones that are going to be passed around. If I can take the liberty of just asking the first question before we do that. Let me ask, though, that when it comes to ask you questions, if you have a question, raise your hand and somebody with a microphone will get to you. If, for the sake of getting as many questions in as possible, if you could keep your questions and as concise as possible, identify yourself and your affiliation, and if you are directing your question to a particular person on the panel, if you could please let us know that too. And again, as I said, we're going to take questions, I think collect them 2 to 3 at a time. As I said, I just want to kick off with a question. It seems that from everything that we've heard that there's agreement that there's certainly progress on the ground, disagreement over whether this is just administrative building or administration building as opposed to state building, or even, I think, as Nathan suggested, administration maintenance rather than construction. And we have this tension between the fragility of the political system and the comparative strength of this administrative or state building process. And then I think one of the big questions we have is, to tinker with Raith's question here, is sort of, should we care about this tension, or whether it's administrative building or something bigger than that? But one of the things I'd like to ask is, and this relates to something Raith just said, when you mentioned that without the security developments, there would be no negotiations, we wouldn't be there. When I was just in Ramallah about a month ago, a little bit more, one of the things I heard, this was in the lead up to when everybody was assuming we were going to get to direct negotiations, but it wasn't yet fully agreed upon. One of the concerns I heard from talking to people in Ramallah and some of the people at the time who sort of involved in the negotiation support unit is, what happens if we get to negotiations? The problem with getting to negotiations that we're not sure can succeed is that there was a feeling that so much of the progress that has been made, which was acknowledged to have been made on the security front, was speared by a real motivation that we were moving towards a state. That there was a state on the horizon and there was progress. I think the fear was, if we start direct talks without any clear direction, and no sense, if these fall apart, as there were fears they will, what happens to that motivation? Does this whole project fall apart? So can you separate the two processes, is the question, I guess, first to Raith or anybody else wants to weigh in, and then we will take questions around the room.
And of course, if the Palestinians look at security as simply contracting Israel's dirty work and only there to protect Israel, and there is no sense that this is leading to statehood, not only will support for this process diminish, I would say more importantly, the actual soldiers, the actual security personnel who are now being trained as, the doctrine they're given is you're doing this to build the state, will lose interest in that. And we will have an internal decay in this. So in that sense, this process has to be seen as leading to statehood. And obviously, the most obvious way of the linkage is, negotiations will lead us to statehood, and this will see us through negotiations. My own concern here, and I think this is a problem in the messaging that we've been hearing there and here, is yes, there has to be hope. Yes, this has to be seen as leading us to statehood. But I don't think that we should have a mechanical linkage between the negotiations themselves and statehood. Meaning, traditionally, all of us who've been involved in the peace process have been so wedded to the negotiation paradigm and thinking no progress can happen only through negotiations. And that continues to be the ideal situation. However, if we reach a point where negotiations will collapse, not out of anyone's fault, basically realizing that at this point a deal is not possible, I would like to see us starting to explore other avenues that will create progress and will start to create momentum on the ground. And we're hearing ideas out there, partial agreement, borders and security first. We're hearing about things about, rolling back the occupation. We're talking about coordinated unilateralism. It's important to link this process, though, to hope. And I think at the moment where the Palestinians feel there is no hope, whether in negotiations or elsewhere, this is where it's going to collapse. Not only externally, but also to implode from within.
If I could, am I on? Yes. There was a whole part of things I wanted to talk about that I didn't because I only got 10 minutes and I only could take 14. To answer this question, taking it down a step from the way Raith just addressed it, to talk about the linkages on the ground between what's happening in terms of economic development and what's happening in terms of security development. The last thing that anybody wants is for there to be tremendous progress in security and no progress in economics or in the other things that people need, health and education and so on. Because then, as Raith said, it looks like the Palestinian Authority is simply doing Israel's security work. When we first went into Jenin, which was a hotbed of terrorism during the Second Intifada, in the spring of 2008, I guess it must have been, we actually went in with a plan that included deploying trained security forces, working with both civil society and the business community, and the head of the U.S. Security Coordinating Team, General Dayton, and I both made our first trips to Jenin together. And we had a couple of joint meetings, and then he went off and talked to the security people. I went off and talked to the business and civil society community. And in the end, the combined efforts not only established security on the ground in Jenin, and it was palpable, but we now have a situation where the unemployment rate has been reduced by about 25%, where businesses that were moribund are thriving in the commercial center, where manufacturing companies that when I made my first trip to Jenin in 2007 were operating at about 25% of their capacity, were once again a year and a half later operating at 75 or 100% of their capacity. And I have to say that some of this was the result of work we did with the government of Israel to open up the principal crossing between the Galil and Jenin to Arab Israelis who are now coming across the border, across the Green Line, at the rate of something like 500 cars a day on average. And this has been a tremendous stimulus. So all of those pieces, as we thought about how can we fix Jenin, all of those pieces had to go in place together, and they had to be coordinated in a way that provided the security envelope that was needed, provided the economic development, and gave people some hope that things are, and some evidence that things were actually getting better. Whether or not it gets to statehood is probably less important to the people of Jenin than the fact that they don't have to worry about their car getting stolen, and they know they're going to have a job.
If we'll start the microphones coming, we have Marina all the way down here, and keep your hand raised, as I said, or at the end of the question, raise your hand.
Thank you very much. It's more of an observation than a question, but I think it goes directly to the issue of the difference between administrative reform and the building of a state. I think it's important to look. Palestine is not a unique case. I mean, it's a unique case in many ways, but we have seen this kind of so-called state building based on administrative reform taking place in a number of other countries. It took place, and let me just give you a few examples. Bosnia, East Timor, Kosovo to some extent. And what we know from previous experience is that the administrative reform can work very well, particularly if you are dealing with a very small entity, a very small country, and a lot of international support and a lot of international intervention. The time that the state building project falls apart is when this entity actually becomes a state. In other words, when the politics intervenes. And that is when we have seen the failure of state building projects in a lot of countries. And so it seems to me that, in a sense, the discussion that we are having is widely premature. Because what is building, and I think Nathan admitted this, is good reforms, it's good steps. Certainly better to have courts that work than courts that do not work. But we are really not going to know whether this can continue until the politics kicks in.
Yeah, we'll go over there. I wonder, as I said, a couple of questions at a time, which we're going to, but I know when you mentioned Bosnia, I know how previous to your stint in West Bank, Gaza, you were the director in the office in Bosnia, so I don't know if you had any comments on that, on the comparative.
I agree completely. In fact, the International Crisis Group just this week issued a new report on Bosnia that's quite pessimistic and apprehensive about what's going to happen in the elections on October 3rd, I think, this year. I watched for 4 years as the politics slowly receded into what looked like a 1991-92 situation with a hardening of the ethnically based parties. At the same time, we had tremendous impact on the ground in terms of economic development and administrative reform, but the political process itself, I have to say, I've been now director in 3 countries where supporting the development of political process has been on the agenda, and it's a very, very difficult place for a donor to operate. It's hard I know how to do economic development, and I know how to train ministries to do their jobs. I don't know very well how to make a political party work. And that's what our political process work typically is. And it's very tough. It's very tough, and we've had very, very mixed results around the world in that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, raise your, over here, please.
Hisham Jabi from Palestine. Actually, just being Palestinian, I don't think people are capable to separate institutional building from political horizon in Palestine. It's very difficult from my observation, because I think there are a lot sometimes of frustration toward the political, toward the Palestinian National Authority claiming or perceiving that Palestinian National Authority is a pro-West entity that trying to compromise their rights. So when there is no horizon in the peace process, this feeling is actually growing. And I believe the credibility of leadership in Palestine is a major issue, to be honest with you, and I think somebody talked about that. And I believe there is a need for a paradigm shift in the way Palestinian young people even see the struggle toward the freedom. We have been seeing a lot of non-violence movement in Bil'in and also Budrus around Bethlehem, which I believe phenomenal. Really, I really think it's a great progress, and I believe what's happening that Dr. Fayyad is not communicating well with Palestinian people, particularly young people, that the road to freedom has different ways, and building institution is probably one of them, because we have a correlation between building institution and have consensus international community support toward the Palestinian state. And that has not been happening yet, and that's a message for Dr. Fayyad.
So a question of communication with the people. Okay, yeah, if we can take one more question from this side and then one from that side, from Scott over there as well, and then we'll bring them back to the panel. And again, if you could please identify yourself.
Hi, yes, my name is Jimmy Anti. I'm with Synexus, and I had two quick questions for the panel. One is on sequencing of institution building, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what institutions you build after you build the security and rule of law regime and how that sequencing works, and how actually culture within the Palestinian area affects the development of institutions. If you could speak briefly on that.
Thank you. And question from Scott over here, and then we'll.
Yeah, Scott Lasensky from the Institute of Peace. I have admittedly a softball question for everyone, but hopefully an interesting softball question. You've all spent, especially Howard Sumka, countless hours, years, talking to Israelis about these issues. Israeli political leaders who are accountable to their electorate, not to Palestinians. Israeli military officials whose job is to protect Israeli citizens, not to keep factories, humming along in Gaza or Jenin. Just give us some insight. Take us into those conversations, if you could. What is a conversation with Israel, with Israeli military and political leaders like, in terms of what's needed to build Palestinian institutions, and in particular, what kind of arguments? You're all Americans, coming from the American side are most persuasive? Because I imagine it's a conversation we're going to continue to have for many years to come in times of war and peace, and times like today that are kind of neither war nor peace.
Okay, thank you. We're going to get the other questions. Just take the ones that we have. I don't know if anybody here has a preference. Raith, you said you wanted to start.
If I might just quickly touch upon a few of the points. The point that Marina raised in terms of problems post-statehood. I mean, transition is always very disruptive in any society, and particularly post-independence transition. I mean, admittedly, I'm no expert, but from what I know is the more that you have anchors in a system, in a political and in a polity, the more that you can manage the transition. And one of the most effective anchors in these is creating a security sector that is non-partisan, meaning it doesn't answer to one political party, but that has a political role in maintaining the constitutional system of an entity. And I think the more that we create stable institutions, the more that they can actually withstand some of the political pressure. And this is, I think, one of the part of the thinking, at least behind the security sector development that we've been seeing. Political messaging, this creates a very important, very difficult, sensitive point. On the one hand, as polls indicate, there's a lot of support for the process of institution building. This support has not been translated into political capital. The problem with that is the minute you start translating this into political machine, into a political party, that's when you go into a head-on collision with particularly Fatah, but the other established political systems. So there is a question of whether it's advisable, and if it's advisable, what the time is, and can it survive being politicized, or is it better off being, for the time being, apolitical in domestic terms. In terms of the Israelis, in the security sector, I think we're seeing amazing progress. And one very telling point is when the terrorist attack in Hebron happened, when the launching was happening. This happened in areas outside the Palestinian security control. And usually the Palestinian forces were not allowed to operate there. What was interesting is that the Israeli commander of the West Bank instructed his people to pull out, let the Palestinian security forces handle the investigation and the follow-up action. This is the degree of confidence that we have not seen even during the Oslo years. There's a sense that I hear when I talk to Israeli military people is we're seeing not perfect yet, not completely comprehensive security service, but we're seeing a new ethos and a new doctrine that is being in place. And this is shifting the way that many of the people in the security establishment who were pro-peace, then after the Intifada turned around and became very cynical, many of them are coming back now to the old kind of role the IDF played in the early 90s. In the political realm, it's a bit more complicated. There are those who actually support it. There are people who actually really support it, in, both in the way that it shows finally Palestinian self-reliance. The words of the Palestinian Ben Gurion, it keeps on coming. It kind of talks to a part of the Zionist mentality that creates a sense of buy-in. On the other hand, there is a lot of concern and fear that this is a prelude to unilateralism and trying to create political realities without coordinating with Israel and without taking Israel's interest into account. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Palestinians go out of their way to say that this is not a unilateral way of creating statehood. This is creating the framework for statehood and creating the kind of infrastructure for statehood.
Thank you. I don't know if Nathan or Neil wanted to address some of the sequencing or the other questions.
Yeah, let me try and say just a few words about the security issue, which a couple of people have raised, and then about the issue of cultural change, which a couple of people raised. In terms of security, I mean, Lucy, that was your question, Scott, your question. I think there is consensus here among all members of the panel that you need a political horizon to sustain this. I mean, and Gheith is trying to come up with some ways to slightly decouple them, but essentially, I would make the same argument that everybody else did, just in kind of a darker, more pessimistic, glass is half empty kind of way. I don't see a political horizon, so this is unsustainable. Okay. And let me factor into that exactly what we mean when we're talking about security, or that is how it appears from people in the West Bank. It is not just about improving traffic flow. That is actually important, and I think it actually does make some difference. But it's also about suppressing a political movement. That's Hamas. It's about purging their supporters from the bureaucracy, firing them. It's about rounding some of them up, and so forth and so on. Now, there are reasons why that is so important to people, especially to the Israelis, but also actually to the current people controlling Ramallah. But it does have a very high political price. Okay, Hamas. There are all kinds of reasons not to like Hamas, but most Palestinians regard it as a legitimate political actor, even those who don't like it. And so it carries some cost to say, okay, this security program is sort of, as people have said, sort of subcontracting for Israel. Can you do it? Yeah, you can do it for a little period. I'm not quite sure how long it's sustainable. And here's where I kind of get to Scott's question. The Israelis have very legitimate security concerns in the West Bank, and my worry, however, is that their bar is higher. That is what you would need to convince the Israelis that this is something that they can rely on, and therefore they're no longer going to go into Area A. Therefore, they're going to actually allow Palestinian security forces to operate in Area C, that sort of thing. Their bar is so high that the sort of thing that you would need to convince Palestinians of the West Bank, this is necessary, this to pay the price. If we're not there now, I don't think we're going to get there. If we're not there after 2 years of this, we're not going to get there. So this is unsustainable. Cultural issues. To what extent does the culture sort of shape the environment for institution building? Here, what I would say, and I want to, in the comment about nonviolence and so on, here I would actually disagree with something that Gheith said about the sort of basis of legitimacy, and about how this program presents itself as sort of self-help and competence and so on. I probably shouldn't say this because I'm an American who lives in Washington, but my perception, as imperfect as that is that is not how the government appears to people in the West Bank. The current government appears not as saying you can do this yourselves, but saying you do this way or else we all lose our jobs and the international financial support gets cut off. Our only hope of getting that international support we so desperately need is to continue with this program. So this is not self-help. This is pleasing the international donors. They say we need Fayyad, fine. We'll take Fayyad. He's a gift, somebody we'd never heard of before until the international, you work for an international financial institution, until the international community said only this man, not even this program, this man is absolutely essential. That's not a culture of self-help. Who is it that presents a message of self-help? Popular resistance committees, the nonviolence campaign, Hamas. These are entities that all have real problems with them. And I'm not sure that any of them represent all that hopeful a solution either. But if you ask who is the one who's saying to Palestinian audience, we can do this ourselves, and the international community is going to do what it's going to do, that's those other actors.
Okay, thank you. Let's start taking a couple of... oh, sorry, Neil, did you have an answer that one? Okay, I'm so sorry. Neil, go ahead.
Just briefly, touch on a couple of points, but in terms of the question, let me go back a step. I think everyone agrees on the fundamental issues on the table, namely institution building is making progress. It inevitably is linked to political process at some point. It inevitably is linked to security and to the peace process at some point. And that comes in many very practical ways, but it means that you can go only to a certain point if you don't see improvement in these two other vectors. But you can make a lot of headway so long as things are continuing apace. In terms of the security issues, I mean, just to put a finer point on what Gaith was saying before, I remember sitting early on in the National Security Forces deployment process with an NSF commander who was looking at all these young members of the force who had been trained. He said, I used to be a fighter. I spent time in Israeli prison. I fought against them. I am now I'm an older man. I'm completely committed to the peace process. I'm committed to building a state. This is what I'm all about now. And all these guys under my command, they are too. But if they don't have the sense that in a couple of years that there is a horizon, that this is leading to statehood, I can't completely be sure that they're not going to point their guns in the other direction. It's a very practical connection between how far you can go and the peace process. But it links in a variety of other ways as well. This notion that you can't be seen as being simply a tool for Israeli security needs manifests itself in a variety of ways. There needs to be Palestinian-Israeli cooperation. There needs to be positive process in order for the Palestinian security system and justice system to work for Palestinian interests. So, for example, if thousands, and this has been the case in the past, and there has been some improvement, if thousands of court orders or arrest warrants can't be delivered because people can't get through checkpoints or because they can't deliver it to areas B and C where it needs to be delivered. If police to transport a dangerous prisoner from jail to court are under restrictions that they need to be unarmed and in a civilian vehicle while transporting this dangerous prisoner, which has happened, they don't. So the guy stays in jail. The Israelis eventually complain and say, see, you're not serious about prosecuting crime. The Palestinian civil liberties people say, see, look at that, you're holding a guy without trial. And all that requires a level of cooperation. And these things happen on a regular basis. I was with the Attorney General one day and he said, we just arrested a major drug dealer, but turns out he had Israeli ID, he comes from East Jerusalem, and so I know what's going to happen under the rules. We hold him, we hand him to the Israelis. They're supposed to prosecute him and put him away. But because the crime's happening here, it's not going to happen. They're going to release him tomorrow. He's going to be back here doing the same thing. And it completely undermines Palestinian public confidence that we can actually do anything to provide security for Palestinian interests. Each of these winds up requiring an ongoing link to a peace process, link to positive cooperation, and it's in both Israeli and Palestinian interests in very practical ways. On the communication issue, it's it's a big gamble because I think part of what Salam Fayyad has tried to do and has said very explicitly, by undertaking this state building, this institution building enterprise, we're going to create enough capacity that statehood becomes inevitable, that we will force the hand of the international community. They will have to recognize us because there will no longer be any excuse to not grant Palestinian statehood. Again, that's a big gamble because there's a limited amount of time that he can play that game, but that seems to be the message that he's been trying to communicate.
Okay. Thank you. I know there's a gentleman at the back who's been waiting patiently and a couple of others, and I'll get a little stricter on we'll try to keep our answers short up here just to get to some of the questions we have.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm Morten Bergsmo. I'm a visiting professor of law at Georgetown, and I'm a Norwegian citizen from Oslo.
Sorry, could you speak up just a little bit?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I had wanted to understand some aspects of public sector building better. First of all, could you say something about the taxation system? Does it work? Can you give us some statistics on that? Secondly, is there a functioning land registry? Are there groups of Palestinians who do not get access to the system of formal title? which again, of course, can be a source of social problems. Thirdly, is there some system of public control of construction and development of land insofar as zoning is concerned, ability to expropriate is concerned, and quality control of actual construction that is done? And my last question concerns just this sector. Is it possible for a Palestinian prosecutor in law to prosecute Palestinians for crimes against humanity or war crimes?
Okay, a lot of questions. Was there? Well, let's just take one more question. We'll try and unpackage some of that. I don't know if we'll get to all of those. Were there any other questions? There's somebody here at the front. Thank you.
This is for Samira Daniels, Ramsey Decisions. This is for Professor Brown. I was just wanting some clarification on, you mentioned just now that, you seem to indicate that suppression of Hamas is a priority, and it translates into this whole reform, administrative, nation building. And I was wondering if that is a accurate implication of what you're saying, that suppressing popular movements ensues from this emphasis on nation building.
Okay, let's. Neil, did you have? There was some on, I know, the justice sector that you might want to answer.
Briefly.
Question.
Howard, did you want to do taxation, or?
I'll wait for you.
Tax revenue, although this is not something that I look at closely, my sense is it has been increasing and improving in terms of implementation of a tax system. The land registry system exists, but it is weak and limited, among other things, because of the fact that many of the land registry records are still in Israel's possession, and that's been an issue of ongoing negotiation and discussion to be able to actually have a complete land registry system. The question of being able to prosecute crimes against humanity or war crimes, there is now a draft new Palestinian criminal code that's undergoing significant review. It will, as of now, would include add in crimes against humanity and war crimes into the Palestinian criminal code, and it will inevitably then bump into Nathan's issue of, okay, under current circumstances, can the PA legitimately issue this and adopt a new criminal code? There's a constitutional debate that goes on, and some people say yes, because under current circumstances, the president has the authority, and that's what the basic law provides for, and there are other people who say, well, maybe not. And that's going to be an ongoing discussion.
Howard, tax and land regulation?
I really can't answer in great detail. The taxation system includes property taxes, licensing, and other kind of fees. One of the largest single sources of Palestinian Authority revenue are the transfer fees for, they're essentially excise taxes that are assessed for goods crossing the Green Line. And those are collected by Israel and then turned over to the Palestinians on a regular basis, unless something's not going well, in which case they get held up. But it's probably in the order of I don't know, $25, $30, $50 million a month of transfer revenues. The land registry Neil talked about, I can say that the Palestinian Lands Authority is not the best functioning institution in the PA, and it's a problem even if you've got all the papers you need, and even if the registry's clear, to try to process it through the PLA. That was not one of the 5 ministries I mentioned in our capacity building, not because we didn't try, I should say. Quality control on construction, theoretically it's there. Whether in fact it operates on the ground like it should is really hard to say. I mean, I think we won't know how well that's going till the next earthquake comes, and nobody wants to see that happen. So I think I caught all of the rest of your questions. I want to go back to the softball question that Scott asked, which is really it's a landmine, at least for me. The insights into my discussions and arguments with Israelis, but let me just say, just not to let it not get talked about at all. Our principal interaction with the Israelis, not exclusively, but our principal one, was with the Crossing Points Authority and the Ministry of Defense, which regulates the movement back and forth across the Green Line. It's a complicated structure, but they are becoming increasingly more responsible for more Green Line crossing points. We worked with them to improve border security. It's the only program that USAID did which actually involved funding for Israeli side activities, because all of our work in that was intended to improve the Palestinian economy. We talked with the Crossing Points Authority. We've been working with them for years. These are people, I have to say, that I'm very fond of and I have a great professional respect for. And they start from the position of, we have to have absolutely zero risk about anything or any person that crosses the border. And we start from the position of, you've got to manage risk, you've got to figure out what the cost of the security is and how you balance that against economic development and so on. We discussed with them literally for a year the opening up of the Jenin crossing point to Israeli Arab vehicles. And it was a difficult back and forth and a lot of technical arguments, and many people were involved at different levels. Tony Blair spoke to Ehud Barak, and I spoke to the head of the Crossing Points Authority, and the ambassador talked to the Director General in the Ministry of Defense. And in the end, they agreed to it. We pressured quite a bit. In a couple of months after it was opened, the head of the Crossing Points Authority, who's a retired brigadier general, said to me, "You were right," not me personally, but you guys were right, and we were wrong about this, and I thank you for pushing us on it because it's had a tremendous impact. I don't think I've ever heard a retired brigadier general apologize or concede any point. And I took that as a real sign that there is a tremendous interest in trying to make things better and to figure out how to do it. At the same time, there's a tremendous fear about the risks that they incur when they do that. And what always made me crazy was I understood both very well, and I'd sort of walk out of meetings feeling totally schizophrenic about how do we deal with this problem. So that I came out of that interaction actually feeling quite positive about what the possibilities might be.
Okay, and Nathan Samira's question about suppression of Hamas and its relationship to the process.
Yeah, if I understood the question, is suppression of Hamas a product of the state-building enterprise? And if that's it, the answer is, I would say no. It gets it reversed a little bit. It's a condition for it. You can't have a state built. You can't have the Fayyad cabinet as it exists. It came into being as part of essentially the split where Hamas seized control of Gaza, and he was brought in as prime minister of the West Bank. I think that. It also, the relationship between the two is also that suppression of Hamas imposes some cost on the state-building project in terms of its popular reception and legitimacy. That is to say, it's seen partly as a power grab, as imposing certain political figures. But I would also say one other thing regarding the suppression of Hamas in the West Bank. Yes, Hamas is being suppressed in the West Bank, but something else interesting is going on as well, and that is Hamas has decided to essentially go into hibernation on the West Bank, partly because of the suppression, and partly, I think, in order to protect what they think they have in Gaza. And I'm so gloomy in everything that I say that I would say that in itself may be a limited, hopeful sign. I think in all kinds of ways, Hamas is a disaster for the peace process, and Hamas is a disaster for Palestinians, but it's there. And the question is then how to deal with it. It will not go away. What its behavior suggests is really for the first time since 2007, or maybe since 2006, Hamas is acting like they're a movement with something to lose, which they didn't have before. And that may offer political openings and opportunities that didn't exist before. I don't really have time to sketch them out, but a Hamas that is trying to protect something and therefore behaving differently as a result may be a Hamas that may be slightly easier to deal with.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for just 2 more questions. Do we have any more questions? Do we have one?
My name is Trond Botnen, also from Oslo. I have a question about the statehood process and how it is actually possible to reach statehood if the negotiation process fails, which I would say a majority of the analysts and observers believe that the current round of negotiations will not succeed. So say in a little bit less than a year from now, the second year of the Fayyad plan is over, there is still no negotiated solutions. What will then happen? It's a little bit like trying to look into the future, but I'm also sure that Fayyad and the Palestinian leaders have thought about this, and that they have some ideas about how they can reach statehood without a negotiated solution. So maybe the question goes primarily to Raith, but also to the others. What other avenues towards statehood exist, and how can one take the final step when the administrative apparatus is there, but the political solution, a negotiated solution, is not there? Thank you.
Okay, and if we want to just get this last question that we seem to have down here.
My name is Sebastian Ulysses, and I'm a student at the University of Maryland. What's the 2 or 5 or 10-year plan, roadmap, or whatever, for United States involvement, not only in the state building, but also the peace process? So it's sort of a general question.
Okay, the challenge now is in the next 5 minutes to address those couple of questions. Raith, I think the first one was directed. Okay.
5 to 10 year plan. There are no such things. On the development side of things, of course, there is, and there's going to be continued involvement. But as a peace process, you know, we are not really. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is thinking from crisis to crisis, and I don't think there is much thinking until after the end of next year. So I'm not quite sure that we are at that point yet. Lots of the energy has been towards reviving the peace talks, and I'm not sure there is a plan beyond that. Which brings me to the first question. It's a little bit premature to talk about that. I still think, I mean, you know, the majority of people might be pessimistic. I still see a good chance of reaching a peace deal in the time allotted. And I'm not going to go deeply into that now, but I'm not willing to write it off. I'm actually quite optimistic when it comes to the prospects. Now, the alternatives, though, it's hard to tell because it depends on how things develop over the next year. I can tell you what are not the alternatives, what will not work. What will not work is purely unilateralism. Simply to reach any sort of statehood, you need Israel's buy-in. Whether through a conflict-ending agreement or a different format, you need Israel's buy-in. Nor would gimmicks work. I mean, the Palestinians every now and then threaten to go to the UN Security Council and get a resolution. It doesn't work that way. And ultimately, if there isn't a sense of buy-in from Israel and from the United States, this will go nowhere. I think it's too premature to talk about specific of how one would deal with a collapse scenario, because that might even start becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I do think that come next spring, you know, March, April, we will get a sense of how realistic a prospect of a deal is, and what are the circumstances surrounding the domestic developments on both sides. And that's when we should start thinking more seriously if we need a safety net to be in place.
Okay. Any other answers up here before we? Yes.
Just about the question about the 5 to 10 year plan, and he says there is none, and yet in my mind that's a problem. Actually, we're so focused on getting to negotiations, so we worry about what will happen in the negotiations afterwards. We're so focused on who it is that we're going to deal with that we actually hook our policies to very, very specific individuals, which I think is deeply problematic. I think that's the kind of question that. I mean, it should be asked by college students, but it should also be asked by high decision makers, and I don't see any sign that it is.
Well, thank you very much. I've been loath to put on the spot. I wanted to welcome Dr. Amal Jadou, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission here at the Palestinian Mission here in DC. I don't know if you had any comments or questions, but
I just have one comment, and that is, we cannot say it's like it's all gloomy or it's all like, hopeful. It's in the middle. And I think that, part of what is this program is doing is actually giving people hope, and it gives them steadfastness on the ground. And just to tie in, boycotting products of the settlements and, trying to prevent our workers from working in settlements is also tying in a political angle to this project that really gives people hope and gives them some kind of direction. So basically, this is, it's what people are finding, that there is some kind of, they want to see a political horizon definitely to it, and they know that, a project by itself is not going to work unless there is a political horizon. But in the meantime, it really gives people some kind of hope, and people really need hope in those difficult situations. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here today. I almost feel like we should have a show of hands. Is institution building succeeding after our panel? But we'll let you discuss that amongst yourselves. Again, thank you for coming. Thank you again to Carnegie for hosting this with us and giving us this wonderful space. And as I said, somebody mentioned nonviolent resistance and the popular resistance. If I can put in a little watch this space plug, we will be doing a panel on that at USIP towards the end of October. So keep in touch with us. And thank you again for coming. Have a great day. Thank you.